Well, hello everyone. Welcome to session 2. We're going to be starting up in the book of Leviticus. But before we get into the word, why don't we spend a moment to prepare our hearts. Jesus, we come to you and we just ask that you would speak to us this morning. We open up our hearts. We open up our minds to you to receive from you. And Lord Jesus, as we talk about these different aspects of the Old Testament, I pray that your truth would just sink in so deeply. Lord, that we would learn more about who you are. Lord, we would fall in love with you even more this morning as we study in your word. Jesus, teach us, we pray. Amen. Amen. So we're picking up in the book of Leviticus, which is on page 8. Now, the book of Leviticus, the name means regarding or relating to the Levites. It's named after the tribe of Levi. As you recall, just in our last session together, we talked about how God chose the Levites, the tribe of Levi, because of their zeal and their faithfulness to God by carrying out his will in the exacting of punishment on Israel for the golden calf incident. And so because of that, God chose the Levites, and they were the ones who were to minister before the Lord forever. And so they were his priestly nation that he chose. And so the book of Leviticus, has to do with how the Levites were to conduct worship and how they were to prepare themselves and Israel. So it really has to do with cleanliness, what it means to be holy, and how to worship in an appropriate manner before God. The theme is how to worship a holy God and living as a people that is set apart. Which of course the word set apart means holy, to be holy. So how to worship a holy God and to be a people who live in such a way as to represent that holiness. So the big picture of the content is it begins with the 5 main offerings. And these are the burnt offerings, the grain offering, the sin offering, the guilt offering, the peace offering. And these were offerings that the people of Israel were to make on certain occasions for certain aspects of worship. And there is at the end of your syllabus, one of the appendixes has to do with the different types of offerings and feasts and so on. And I encourage you to check that out. In fact, the study of it, just on your own personal time, a study of the different offerings and how they were done and how it correlates to us in the New Testament is a very valuable study for you. So I encourage you to do that. The next section talks about the ordination of the Levites as the priests. And so it's a section where God brings forth the Levites, and Aaron represents the tribe, and they ordain them and set them as these are the priests to minister before me, God says. The next section goes into the laws of cleanliness. And in chapter 11, verse 45, it kind of gives a thesis for this, where God says, you must be holy because I am holy. And this is actually kind of the thesis verse for all of the book of Leviticus, and is repeated several times throughout, that the nation of Israel, and in this particular case, specifically the priests, were to be holy because they represent a holy God. And so their lives, their conduct, their worship, everything that they were to do had to be done in holiness. And Leviticus chapters 11 through 15 explains how they were ordained, how they were established, how they were to minister before the Lord in the tabernacle, and so on. The next section are the feasts of the Lord and the temple worship. And again, this is mentioned in the appendix 1, and so you can look that up. But all of the different feasts and festivals, such as Passover, that of unleavened bread, first fruits, Pentecost, trumpets, atonement, tabernacles. Each one of these has some aspect of it, again, represented in the New Testament. But all of it, either from the types of offerings to the festivals, all represented how we are to worship God in accordance with his holiness and with his nature. And so aspects of it show God as a God of grace, as a God of love, as a God of compassion, as a God of justice, as a God of holiness. And so there are different aspects of those that have specific meaning. God just didn't give them a bunch of different offerings and a bunch of different feasts, just so that they could do religious activities. God doesn't give us things to do simply for the faith, for the point of just doing activity. God instituted these as ways of worship that again translate into our modern day, even though we don't sacrifice the same way. Confession, repentance, these are all aspects of the offerings that we give. Okay? Offerings of praise and worship. Then it goes into the last part of it, chapters 18 through 27, talks about the regulations outlining what a holy life looks like. Now remember, we're talking about a people who had just come out of Egypt, and they come out of a depraved culture, which practice all kinds of sinful practices. They're going into an even more depraved culture with the Canaanites. And so God says, this is what you are to do and how you are to live. This is what you are, how you are to conduct yourselves. And so there are all of these particular laws. And most of these are ceremonial laws of how they are to be holy in relationship with other people. So there's a lot about sexual purity in there, how they are relate to one another in civil ways. And so it says, this is how you are to live a holy life. In other words, the whole point of it is, because you are my people, God says, you are not to look like the nations that are around you. God repeats this theme. You are not to look like the nations that are around you. You are to look completely different. And here's how it would look in relation to my character. And so he goes through and explains what it means to be holy as God's representatives. And again, in Leviticus 19:2, he echoes this. For now, as a nation, you are to be holy because I am holy. And you are to live your lives in such a way to represent that. And he describes what is clean and what is unclean. Physically, so what animals they were to eat and not to eat, what you were to do with certain aspects of daily life and cleanliness, certain bodily discharges, and how you would go through the process of cleansing yourself so you're physically clean. But every one of these physical cleanliness things has a spiritual counterpart. It's also about being spiritually clean. And it's not just physical, right, the cleanliness, but it's also it's represented in the heart. And there's a spiritual aspect to this, of cleanliness. And that really is at the heart of the book of Leviticus, is that there are these outward things that we do in worship, but all of them point to the heart. And it is the heart that God is concerned about, a heart that is clean before Him, that is contrite and broken before Him, that lifts up and magnifies God. And all of that is what the book of Leviticus is about, proper worship of God. Okay, in the next section here is a student response required. And it says, what does it mean when we say God is holy? And what did it mean for Israel to be holy? So think that through. I encourage you to read through some of Leviticus, but think through, what does it mean for us when we say that God is holy? And then how does that translate into His people being holy? Okay, let's move on to the book of Numbers. Now, the English name for this book comes from the Septuagint. Now, if you haven't heard that word, the Septuagint is the English, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. So, for example, the Old Testament was written in Hebrew and Aramaic, and the New Testament is written in Greek. And so the Old Testament, within the New Testament period of time, the Old Testament was translated from the Hebrew into the Greek for the common people to read, just as we translate into English for our vernacular, right? So we can read it. Likewise, they translated the Hebrew into the Greek. And so much of what the New Testament writers draw from is actually the Greek Septuagint. But it is the Greek Septuagint, which is the Old Testament again in Greek, that translates this word for numbers. And it means census, which means, accounting, right? So that's where we get numbers from. And it really has to do with a census that begins at the very beginning of the book. It begins with the census of all of Israel. But the Hebrew name for this book means in the desert. It refers to, this is the the account of how they walked through and how they journeyed through the wilderness from the time that they left Egypt until Joshua was about to lead them into the promised land. And so it's a story of their wilderness wanderings. The theme is God's dealing with his children, with the children of Israel in the wilderness. So all of it has to do with what happened in that period of time. Let's give a real quick big picture of the content of the book. It begins with the departure of from Sinai. Chapter 1:1, of course, Sinai is where God gave the people of Israel his law. Right? That's where Moses went up and met with God on Mount Sinai, with the giving of the Ten Commandments, and the law was given there in Exodus chapter 20 and on. And it explains how these people transition from being a nation under slavery to a nation that's now under God, that is free, and they are his people, his chosen people. The beginning has a census and explains how the 12 tribes of Israel were categorized and how they were arranged. Then it talks about how the tabernacle was to be taken and setting up and how the offerings worked, and kind of walks through that from a more practical point of view. And it also outlines this idea, the truth that Israel continues to struggle believing in God, even though he has, time and time again, done these incredible miracles. Or these people have seen the 10 plagues in Egypt. They've seen God be faithful. They've seen God lead his people, protect his people, deliver them out of Egypt, provide for them as they left Egypt, brought them to the Red Sea by physically a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, so they saw the presence of the Lord, led them to the Red Sea where God parted the Red Sea, and they saw God provide another deliverance through the Red Sea miraculously. Then they watched God, the next part of that, very next part of the journey is they go to the Marah and the lake, the waters of Marah, which were bitter. And then God said, we'll throw the stick in, and it became sweet. And so you have Marah, then you have providing water from a rock, providing of manna, and God provide over and over and over again. And yet, for some reason, the people of Israel have a hard time trusting that God will continue to be faithful. And they continually doubt God's goodness and God's favor of his people. And so when it comes to the time when they were to enter into the land, they went from Sinai, they went straight to the promised land, the border. That was their goal. They went from Sinai to the promised land to enter it. And it was when they got there that once again they said, are we sure? Are we sure this is what God is he really going to come through this time? And so they sent the 12 spies into the land. And so Numbers chronicles the whole story of the 12 tribes going in, or 12 spies. And of course they go in and they see giants in the land. They see this land is flowing with milk and honey as God had promised. And 10 of the spies say, man, this is we can't do it because basically we don't think God is as big as the giants that are in the land. And there was only 2 spies that came back, Joshua and Caleb, that said, man, there's so much potential. God has given us a good land. Let's go. And those 2 different perspectives shows you the heart of what's going on in Israel. There are a small remnant of people that are just so on fire, so excited about what God is doing. You have, for example, Moses and Aaron, the 2 leaders of Israel. You have these 2 spies, Joshua and Caleb, that are excited. But then you have the majority of people who are just saying, I don't think that God's really going to be faithful this time. And what a commentary that is on our lives. That there are times when we are just so full of faith, so believing that God is going to lead, God has provided. And there are times, more often than not, that doubt creeps in. And we say, okay, yes, God was faithful in the past, but is he going to be faithful today? And sadly, that happens far too often. God's anger burned against the people of Israel because of this. And he said, because of your disobedience, because you listened to the 10 spies and you did not listen to my word, that none of this generation that's standing at the border of the promised land, none of you are ever going to see the inside of that land. You will never see the promise because of your disobedience and your doubt and your refusal to trust my promise. Yet, Joshua and Caleb, because of their faithfulness, and you see it in the book of Joshua, they were allowed to enter the land and inherit the land because of their faithfulness. And so they lose their opportunity to enter the promised land. And they're now forced to, for this entire generation, to wander the wilderness until everyone dies. That is a stiff punishment. But God is serious about our faith in stepping into his promises. And so the rest of the story of the wanderings of the wilderness is not a story of God punishing his people and abandoning them. It's actually a story of God's continuing to provide for them, continuing to care for them, continuing to be their God. And it's interesting because no matter what God does, these people just never learn their lesson. And it wasn't until this entire generation died that they were able to walk into this new promise, the promised land. In chapter 22 to 36 talks about a new generation that can now enter into the promised land. It begins with this Balaam story. Balaam's an interesting story, right? It's the story of this supposed prophet of God who's hired actually to pronounce a curse on the people of Israel because the king is afraid of them. And so he's asked to come and curse Israel. And of course, as he goes, the donkey avoids the angel, speaks to him, that whole part of it. But really, I think the bottom line thing about the story of Balaam that stands out to me is the fact that God is for his people. And even when Balaam got up because he was hired to pronounce a curse on the people of Israel, he couldn't do it. Instead, he pronounced a blessing because God is going to bless his people. And so I think the thing that stands out to me is that no weapon formed against us will prosper. No curse that's spoken over God's people has any power over his blessing. And that God is chosen this people and he is going to preserve these people. The next part of this is the story of the Transjordan tribes who settled for life on that side. This is a really sad story to me. Again, a great story, a great application for our spiritual lives too. Because here are the people of Israel. They're wandering around, waiting to enter the promised land, waiting 40 years to enter the promised land. And there were two tribes, Reuben and Gad. And it says that they had a lot of livestock. And they looked and they thought, you know what? If we cross over into this promised land, we don't know what it's going to look like. But we see this stuff on this side of the Jordan. We see this land, and it looks good for us. It looks good for our livestock. It looks good for our families. Can we just settle here and not go into the promise? And that was the beginning of the demise of the peoples, because they chose not to go into the promise, and they were the first ones to give up faith and the promise of God and said, we just want to settle here with what we see with our eyes because we know this is good, but we don't really know what God has for us. Again, what a commentary that is on our own spiritual lives and how quickly we can settle in our hearts for what we see because it looks good to us. This situation, this particular thing is in front of us, this opportunity, this job, this whatever it is, right in front of us seems good. And we know that God has a plan, but we want to settle, our hearts want to settle right here and not take that step of faith into what God has, into his unknown promise, unseen promise of what he has for us. And so we need to be careful in our hearts not to settle too quickly with what we see in front of us, but to continue to trust and believe that God has a plan and to walk into that promise. Then the last part of the book of Numbers talks about their journey. So it actually goes right back to the beginning. It's interesting to read. It goes through and lists all the places from when they left Egypt, every stop that they made along the way. And it shows all of their journeys. And then it explains the boundaries of the land that they're about to take over. It's basically a command, a drawing out saying, here, when you guys go into the promised land, here's where you go to. And it was not as much saying, here's a land that you are to settle in and go no further. It is, here's the land that you're to settle in and make holy. In other words, from these borders, you are to drive out every other nation that's in those lands outside of that land, because this is where God's people dwell. And so when you enter the land, you are to push out, to expel, to force out every other nation from those lands. And this is the boundary from where God's people are. So that was the purpose of the boundaries. Okay, let's move into the book of Deuteronomy. At the end of this journey, as the people are about to enter the promised land, they get there, and Moses wants to make sure that people know what God expects from them. And so the book of Deuteronomy is basically a really long sermon that he gets up and Moses explains to the people of Israel what God's expectations of his people are. So Deuteronomy means the retelling of a law, or the second law. Basically, it's Moses re-explaining the law that was given in Exodus chapter 20 and onwards, and saying this is what God's expectations are. And it shows that it follows this certain pattern of what would have been of the contemporary covenants of Moses' day. So he explains that here's this covenant, here's this plan. So here's what happens if you obey. Here's what happens if you disobey. If you obey, you will be blessed. If you disobey, this is what will happen. And so it kind of outlines, so basically Moses is standing there giving this lecture, explaining to them the covenant, saying, here are the blessings if you follow it, here are the curses when you don't. And it's interesting to me that I believe that there's a prophetic element to the book of Deuteronomy, because I believe that Moses knew by the enlightenment of the Holy Spirit that the people would not follow. And I think his heart grieved, and I think that's part of why he's telling it this way. He's saying, if you obey, this is what will happen. You will be blessed, right? But I think part of him in his heart knew the stiff-necked tendencies of these people. He's seen it for 40 years. They're constant moving away and rebelling and disobeying. And so it's almost as if he is saying, here's what will happen if you follow him. But when you rebel, this is what's going to happen. And he prophesies the judgment that will come in Babylon many, many, many centuries later. And so he explains, the theme of this is the blessings and curses of the law. That's the theme for the book. Okay, let's get into the big picture before I ramble on too far. Big picture of the content is God renews his covenant with his people by reminding them of the past. So the first 4 chapters, he talks about where they came from. Deuteronomy 1, verses 6 to 8 says that they are to advance. God gave you the promised land. He promises to you, so you're to advance and take possession of a land the Lord swore to give to your fathers, to give to you guys. In other words, these other nations that are in there don't belong there. They're squatters on God's land that he's promised. And now it's time for you guys to go and completely take possession of the land and dispossess the other nations and push them out. Then he talks about the stipulations of the covenant. So all of this, what's going to look like. What does this covenant look like for you? And in the middle of this particular section is probably the most important aspect of Jewish life and culture. And it comes in Deuteronomy chapter 6. It's called the Shema Yisrael. And it's Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, which is, hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. This is an incredibly important statement for the Jewish people. From that day on, it was a thing that was repeated throughout every generation. It especially was galvanizing when the people got to the land of Babylon and they had forgotten for so many years who God was. And it was actually in the land of Babylon that they formalized this Shema Yisrael. and they began to covenant that they would never, ever, ever forget again. And we'll get to that later in our course when we talk about Babylon. But it really is at the heart, right from Babylon to the Holocaust that happened in Nazi Germany. This is the sentiment that unified the Jewish people, that they are part of God's people, that they are a chosen people. And so it's, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one." And of course, this is also significant because it emphasizes the oneness of God. You see, in this particular period of time, people worship all kinds of gods, right? It was a very polytheistic nations around them. Every nation was polytheistic. And they came in, and God said, "I am one." So it is the monotheistic, one God. And that was one of the things, the key things that distinguished the Jews from the other nations, is that they believed that there was one God, and He had chosen them. The whole aspect of this, chapter 6, so it begins with the Shema Israel. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one." But then the next part of it is, because of this, you are to teach your children. And it says whether you're walking along the road or you're sitting in your house, no matter what, you are to teach your children, and you are to bind these words of the law, this covenant that God has made with you. You're to bind them on your foreheads. You are to put them on the doorposts of your house. In other words, put them where you will remember them. You will speak them to your children, and where you live will be in the Word of God. And so this is an important aspect because it is the very thing that Israel forgot to do. And we'll talk about that in the next book, the next several books actually. But he says, teach your children. And when they see these monuments, and when they hear of these things about how God brought them out of Egypt, you are to tell them, this is who God is, this is what He's all about, this is His favor, this is what He has done for His people, because we are His covenant people. And then the next part of that is, this is how we are to live as His covenant people. That was the whole point of what God was teaching the people in those 40 years that they wandered the wilderness. And Deuteronomy chapter 6, for the rest of 3 through 19, talks about how you are to teach everyone, teach your children, you are to bind these words to remember who God is, putting Him first. And of course, in this particular section, it also says these words, that we are to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your mind. And that, of course, is essential to the Jewish faith and to ours. So this whole section here of Scripture, Deuteronomy chapter 6, is, I would say, at the very heart of the law and of the covenant. The "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one." You are to love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind, and also your strength. And you are to teach your children. Wherever you are, in every situation, you are teaching God. So when they see these things, they will know that I am the Lord your God. That is at the heart of it. And then later on in the book, from chapters 27 to 30, talks about the blessings of obedience and the curses that follow the disobedience. And as I mentioned earlier, I really feel like Moses knew that because of these people's track record, that they were not going to follow God for long. So he is pleading with them. These are Moses' last words. After he speaks these words, he goes up the mountain and is taken by the Lord, and Joshua takes over leadership. And so this is his last words to his people, saying, please, please, I beg you, follow the Lord. And then, of course, chapter 31 to 34 talks about the succession of leadership from Moses to Joshua. And that Moses went to be with the Lord, and Joshua is now going to be the person who will now lead the people into the promised land. Now I want to make some quick mention about the law. This is the end of the Pentateuch, the end of the Torah, the law. But let's just take a minute and kind of reflect a little bit. When we look at the Old Testament law, and we talk about the law, there's a lot of misconceptions about what the law is, and in its validity for today. There's a lot of maybe misunderstandings about why God would say certain things. Now, I want you to just remind you again that we're talking about a people who had zero moral compass. going into this. Their moral compass was defined by the Egyptian people. And so they're coming out and they have nothing. And so God gives them this law. And he says, you are not to look like the nations that are around you. You're going to look very different. And here's how it would look. So I want to compare it to the Hammurabi. Now, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Hammurabi. The Hammurabi Code was the ancient laws of a land. It was kind of accepted as this is what a nation, this is how you are to act. So the Hammurabi Code was defined. It would be set up in the middle of a city as a pillar with this law that was written on it. And the whole point of it was to show how you were to deal with certain issues of justice. And so if someone were to steal, how do you deal with that? Things like if someone were to steal, you were to cut off their hand. And so there's a lot of punishment that's mentioned in the Hammurabi Code. But at the heart of it, it was how to treat other people. And God's law is very, very different. I mean, you read in the law, right? An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. You read in the law that if this were to happen, you were to put them to death. And if that happened, you were to... It talks about a lot of these different punishments. But I want to explain something to you about the law that God gave his people. Because at the very heart of it is respect for one another. Remember, the Ten Commandments, the first 4 are about God, but the rest of them are about how to treat other people. And even there are 3 major areas where the law is countercultural to the law of Hammurabi in any other nation. And that is in the treatment of slaves, in the treatment of women, and the treatment of foreigners. The treatment of slaves. In the Hammurabi, if a slave were to run away, well, you kill them. That's it. There's no. If a slave were to run to you, then you were to kill them because they're useless. They have no value. That's turned on its head in God's law. He says, in fact, every person has worth. And so if a slave runs away from another nation and comes to you, you are to bring them in and you are to care for them. You are to feed them and you are to give them service. What kind of a service is that? We're talking about slavery. We're actually talking about indentured service, which means that they would work off a debt. And so slavery actually in the Old Testament is not like the slavery that you would see in, let's say, the southern United States of the previous century. Right? Some of those things, those cruelties that we think of when we hear the word slavery, because that's really not what the Old Testament is talking about. The Old Testament really never condones that type of slavery. What it condones, what it actually outlines in the Old Testament law, is what we would call indentured service, which means that they would work it off. In fact, it's a brilliant social program. Let's say, for example, that you got yourself into trouble and you owed money to somebody. And they could take you to court and take all of your possessions and all your land. The law would say instead, have them come and be your slave. Now, it doesn't mean slave or even servant in the same case. It's more as a hired hand. They are to come, and this is what the law prescribes, that they would work for you, and that would pay off their debt, but they would also be earning a wage so they could support their family. So in other words, it's a debt-free program. That's more what slavery in the Old Testament looks like. Very different, perhaps, than the picture of slavery that you've had in your mind about what slavery is. And so when we say that we talk about slavery in the Old Testament, God talks about slavery, understand that it's not the same type of slavery as you're familiar with. In fact, it's an amazing social program, a debt-free program to help people get onto their feet. Now, at the end of so many years, every 7 years, what were the Jews to do? They had to let everybody go. All of the people who were working and cancel their debts. That was the year of the every 7th year they were to do that. And on the 50th year, cancel every debt, everything, right? It's the year of Jubilee. In other words, here's the thing. If somebody was working for you on the 49th year and they owed you, let's say in modern day, that they would owe you hundreds of thousands, $500,000. Let's just pick that. And they, on the 49th year, they had to come into service. Well, you had to take them in. A portion of that would go against the debt. And then you would give money for their family to live. And the next year, all of that debt would be canceled, and they would be completely relieved from it and go on as if there was no debt. It's an amazing thing, slavery in the Old Testament. It shows God's love and his grace and his provision for his people. Second thing is how God treats women in the Old Testament. In no other culture are women valued than in God's law, where God makes provisions for how women are to be treated as individuals, as people of dignity. And so you see all of the laws in the Old Testament are actually there to protect a woman. Even when you look at some of the laws where it shows that if a woman were to be raped, for example, then she had to marry. You look at that and say, well, that's absolutely horrible in today's society. And perhaps that would look that way today. But in that particular culture, the alternative would be that she would be on her own. She wouldn't be allowed to live with her family because of her shame. She wouldn't be able to work. She would have nothing. She would have to be sent off to the desert to die. And so there was provisions in place to protect women from the treatment that was common in the places around them. And so God shows that his dignity towards women. The last one I want to talk about real quickly is foreigners. God's treatment of foreigners. And that is that the people who are outside of God's covenant, people who had come in from outside, were to be treated with fairness and were to be offered land, or they were to be offered provisions and to take care of them. Very different than other cultures. Whereas if someone had come into your land from outside, then they were either you could kill them or you could put them into servitude and slavery. Of course, slavery, not even servitude as the Bible defines it. But God says, if the foreigner comes in your land, you are to give them. You are to provide for them. You are to give them a job. You are to give them land. You are to take care of them. And so God's treatment of foreigners is very different than what you see in the nations around them. And so God has high regard for the foreigner, for the widows and the orphans and the women, as well as for slaves or servants. Very different in the law around you. So whenever anyone gives an objection to the God of the Old Testament and citing some of these Old Testament laws, because look at how could God do such a thing? How could God allow slavery? I want you to understand that it looks very different than what it does for us today. And in that culture, it is the most humane, it is the most loving and gracious way to deal with people and shows dignity, far above any other culture. And really a good person to read about this is a guy named Paul Capan. He talks about is God a moral monster? Talks about aspects of the Old Testament and how we would understand it today. So that's another book that you could pick up if you so wish to pursue that. So that ends our section on the law and the Torah, part 1. So let's move into part 2, and we're going to talk about this is really the beginning of the historical books. We're going to look at the age of the judges. And this begins the first 12 books of the historical books. But the age of the judges, the books that encompass that time are Joshua, Judges, and the book of Ruth. Ruth is actually a story that's kind of intermixed in the middle of the book of Judges. And as we get into the book of Judges, we'll kind of see where that fits in. But they talk about how these judges gave leadership over the Israelites after Moses' death. So when Moses died, these are the people who kind of led and in a sense brought justice and kind of acted as that mediator between God and his people after the death of Moses. The first is Joshua. So Joshua picks up right where Deuteronomy leaves off. So Deuteronomy ends with Moses, the leadership changing from Moses over to Joshua, and Joshua picks up with beginning this ascension into leadership and now leading the people into the promised land. The theme is Israel crossing the Jordan and taking possession of the promised land, which doesn't happen in Joshua's lifetime. It begins, but it's actually a process that goes on into the book of Judges, and so on. Okay, big picture view of the content. begins with this statement here: Moses, my servant, is dead. Then there's this promise. Moses was God's man for that period of time. Moses was a selfless leader. Moses poured his whole life into leading these people, and God said he was my leader. And now he turns and says, "Now Joshua, just as I was with Moses, so I'm going to be with you." Now I don't know. Joshua wouldn't have been a young man. I mean, sometimes I think we think he would be young, like 40 years old or something, as he took leadership. But you got to think about this. He would have been at the age of majority of adulthood, so probably around 30 years old, when the people sent the spies into the promised land. Remember? And then he came back and he wandered for 40 years. So we're talking about a 70-year-old man, somewhere around there, now taking leadership. He's not a young guy, right? In fact, he's the oldest in Israel. He and Caleb are the only two surviving. He's old. But yet this is his first time taking leadership. And in many aspects of it, he's like a young leader. He's taking over from Moses. And I'm sure that was a daunting, intimidating thing. Who wants to take over from Moses? Right? He split the Red Sea. Right? He could put water from the stone. I mean, I'm sure that Joshua's mind, I'm sure he was just freaking out. Because now he's got to step into the shoes that Moses filled. But God's promise at the beginning of Joshua chapter 1 is, I'm with you. I am with, just as I was with Moses, I'm going to be with you. And all that I did for Moses, I'm going to do for you. Don't you worry. I'm just asking you to trust me. Be bold and courageous. Have I not called you? Am I not the one who's leading you? He says, just follow me. And he encourages Joshua. He says, just be in the Word. All of the things that Moses commanded, remember those things, meditate on them, keep them in your heart, keep them on your tongue, follow them, and I am going to be with you. So be strong and courageous. And so Joshua steps into this leadership, and it begins with the first couple of chapters, begins with them moving into the land. The first 12 chapters talk about how they entered the promised land and how they began the conquest of the land. And then they divided up the land. So the very beginning is they cross the Jordan. The interesting part of this story of them crossing the Jordan is it's very similar to the crossing that happened with Moses. Remember, Moses stood at Egypt as the army was coming, and God said, "Raise your staff," and the waters parted, and they walked across on dry land. Very similar. There's this river. The River Jordan is at flood stage, it says, in chapter 2 of Joshua. And here they are standing there, and they don't know what to do. And so God says to Moses, or to Joshua rather, "Here's what you're going to do. You're going to take the 12 leaders from the 12 tribes of Israel. You're going to grab the ark, right? And you guys are going to walk across the water. And as you walk across the water, I will part the waters." And so they walked, and just as Moses parted, or God parted the sea with Moses for them to enter the wilderness, God, through the faith of his people who stepped into the waters, parted the lands as they exited the wilderness and into the promise. And so they walked into the promise. And the first thing that they do is they renew their covenant with God. The people that had been wandering around the wilderness for these 40 years had never been circumcised. So they renewed the covenant to God. Remember, they just had, in a sense, a renewal of this covenant with Moses. And now they've entered the promised land, and they're doing it again. So Joshua rather, reads the law, explains to them the covenant once again. They just heard it, and they re-circumcise themselves, and now they are ready. And the next part of the story is the conquest of Jericho, Ai, and Gibeonites. And Jericho was their very first obstacle. And interestingly, it was the most formidable of all the cities that they were going to take. It was a walled city. It was the first walled city in ancient civilization. And they come to this city with these huge walls and this daunting thing. And God says, "Don't worry. All I'm asking you to do is obey. I want you to march around. You know the story. March around, and I'm going to take care of the rest. And so they were. They were obedient, as silly as I think it seemed. And here's the interesting thing. I think that if any leader had heard or thought they heard God say, I want you to walk around the city for 7 days, 7 times, last time, 7 times, and I'm going to make the walls fall down as you toot on some horns. I think that they would think that they had either misheard or, maybe I don't know, that God was crazy. Yet Joshua had heard and he has seen God do all of these miracles. And I think for Joshua, because of his, he's later in life, he's seen the hand of God. And I think he was one who said, God has done this before. He's done crazier things than this before. I believe him. And he did not hesitate for one moment to tell the people, this is what we're going to do, and God's going to come through. And God did. And so they went through and they did exactly as God promised. And there was one condition. You are not to touch any of the spoils of a land. Now, this is a tithe. This is the first fruits. He says you are to touch none of it. All of the stuff that you see, all of the gold and the silver and the articles and everything is to be put into the Lord's treasury. It's a tithe. Don't touch it. And so God did this miracle. The walls came down. The people went through Jericho. And one man, Achan, coveted with his eyes some of the articles and took it for himself secretly. So they get to the next city. They just defeated Jericho. They come to Ai, small little city, small little town. And this was going to be a walk in the park compared to Jericho. And so they decided to head off and just do this on their own. And they came back and said, hey, this is not a big city. And so Josh was like, yeah, no problem. Just take a couple guys with you. Go take this land. We're good. And 36 men died. And Joshua falls down on his face. He weeps. Why did this happen this way, God? Why? I love God's response. In Joshua chapter 6 or 7, he says to Joshua, why are you upset? Why are you falling on your face crying? Don't you know that you have dishonored me with the devoted things? Because you took them for yourselves. And so he says, that's why you have no, and my hand is against you. You will not see victory because you have stolen, you have lied, and you have taken what was mine and put it into your own possessions. So they cast lots, and they went down through all of the tribes to find out that it was Achan. It was Achan, and he said, yes, it was me. I saw it, I took it, I coveted it, I took it for myself. And what's interesting is this phrase that God says, that because one man took the devoted things for himself, that God's curse was on the whole community. Interesting thing, it has to do with the tithe. Interesting, if you look at Malachi, the famous passage that we read in Malachi about how we have robbed from God. And God says, there's a curse on your whole community because you have robbed and you have stolen and you have withheld the tithe from me. The interesting thing is that God has judgment, brings a curse on the people, on the whole community because of one man's sin. But also it is one man's sin that is atoned for that brings the restoration of the people. And so God says, you're going to take and you need to get this sin out of the camp. It has no place here. This disobedience has no place. So they took Achan out and he was stoned, he and his family. And when that sin was removed from the people, that God restored his favor. And then they inquired of God, and God gave, and they went and they took Ai. And then the very next story is interesting. Here is Joshua. He just saw God provide miraculously at Jericho deliverance because they obeyed him. Then they didn't really listen to him. They kind of did it on their own. And there was this incredible lesson that they learned about the devoted things to God, and that they needed to be following his decrees. Then the very next story is these Gibeonites, and they come, and they're the next city in line to be destroyed, and they know that. And so they pretend they're from a far off place. So they put on dirty clothes, they get some moldy bread, and they come up to Joshua under a flag of truce. And they say, oh, we've come from a long, far way off. Look, our clothes were new, our bread was freshly baked when we left. And we've traveled from a long distance away. And so would you make a covenant with us and protect us? And Joshua knows the law. He just finished telling it. And the law was, how do you treat foreigners? Right? You bring them in. And you take care of them and you provide for them. So he says, sure, we'll make a covenant with you. But they had lied to them. They had deceived them. And it's interesting, it says in there that Joshua did not consult the Lord. And so he quickly made a covenant with one of the nations that they were supposed to get rid of, one of the Amorite nations that they were supposed to have expelled and dispossessed from the land. They had just made a covenant with because he didn't consult with the Lord. It's interesting to me because here is this great man of faith. And as soon as he's presented with this challenge, he does not consult the Lord. The first thing that he does, he makes a decision based on his own knowledge. And he wasn't necessarily wrong. The knowledge that he went off was good. It was right from God's law. But here's the thing. What he saw in front of him wasn't of the Lord. Sometimes you see in life and in ministry, if you're in ministry, that we know God's law. We know his word. You know, we live in it daily and we go through. And there are times that we make decisions that are based on things that are right in front of us. And that seemed like a really good decision at the time. But what Joshua didn't do, he didn't ask God, is this really what I'm seeing? God, what are you doing here? Like, how should I respond to this? Because God would have said, no, this is a nation trying to trick you. You are to expel them from the land. Sometimes we take things at face value instead of saying, Holy Spirit, am I perceiving this right? What's happening? Give me discernment. And so this lesson from the Gibeonites for us as pastors and leaders and people who are working and doing God's mission is to say, may I not rely on the knowledge that I have. May I not rely on the things that I see, but may I rely on the Spirit. And so in every situation that we come upon, to say, Holy Spirit, what are you doing here? What's happening? Teach me, show me, reveal to me, help me to discern what's really going on here so that I know how you would have me proceed. And so it's a great lesson for us how to follow and depend on God and not our own understanding. The rest of the book from chapters 12 through to 21, which isn't the rest of the book, but the next section, is a division of the promised land. And so they're pursuing those boundaries that were defined in the book of Numbers. I want you to go out, and what Joshua does is says, okay, yeah, you guys go. This is your land. This is your land. Go possess it. Go possess it. And to each nation, he says this: go and take this land from this boundary and this river to these mountain range, and go in there and drive out all the nations as the Lord has commanded you to do. So all of these nations all of the tribes begin to go into their own land that has been allotted for that tribe, and they are pushing out all of the other nations, because that's what they're supposed to do. And then chapters 22 to 24 is the final days of Joshua. Chapters 22 to 24, he gathers them together, very much like Moses had done. Whenever Moses brought the people of Israel together, he retold the law in Deuteronomy. This is exactly what Joshua does. He does exactly what he was shown and taught by Moses. So he gathers the people back from their lands and he says, okay, now you guys, here you go. You need to finish the job because I can see that even though you have taken the land, there are still some of these Amorites and Jebusites and Hittites, right? They're all still sitting in your lands. You got to fully possess it. You got to drive them completely out. Otherwise, their gods are going to taint your hearts, and you will begin to turn away from God, and you will worship those idols. And all those curses of the law are going to come on you because you've aroused the Lord's anger, so don't do it. He says you need to get rid of all of the other nations, get rid of the idols, get rid of the high places, and worship the Lord your God only. As for me and my house, Joshua says, we will serve the Lord. And so you need to decide this day who you will serve. And the people said, we will serve the Lord. And Joshua warns them. He says, I want you to think about what you're saying. Because if you say, we will serve the Lord only, that means you have to get rid of the idols. You have to clear the land, and God will hold you accountable, and he will be very angry if you do not obey. Oh yeah, we're going to do this, they say. He says, finish the task and hold on to the Lord. That's where it ends, the book of Joshua.